Hello everyone, my name is Sue Yengle. I'm the Director of SEUK and the Principal Investigator for the Centre for Care. Very pleased to welcome everyone to today's seminar. The seminar is going to focus on the contribution of social enterprises to adult social care in England, and so has got real relevance for our current work in the Centre for Care, but of course more widely there's a huge set of issues in adult social care in England which lots of us are concerned about, and gaining insights from new research on any aspect of it, and in particular the role of social enterprises, I think, is very important. Kelly Hall has her PhD, I think, from the University of Birmingham, but might be wrong on that. She's a reader in social policy there, and she holds an NIHR Research Leaders Award, so her work's been recognised for the contribution that she's made in work on social care, on ageing and on migration and the third sector. Kelly worked with us in the Sustainable Care Programme, which ran from 2017 to 2021, and did a fascinating study on Brits living in Spain and their challenges during the period of Britain's departure from the EU, particularly those who are ageing and needed care and support. And she's published some interesting work on that, and I'm very much valued the contribution that she made to our work within that programme. So it's a great pleasure to introduce her to you all for today's seminar. Over to you, Kelly.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sue. I'm just going to... so, yeah, great to see so many of you here today. Sort of recognise quite a few faces. So what I'm going to do for the next 40 minutes or so is talk through some research I've recently completed that is looking at the contribution of social enterprises to adult social care in England. It's a study that was funded through the School for Social Care Research, so through the NIHR. It was a 2-year study, finished late last year. It's research that I've carried out with some colleagues at the University of Birmingham, Chloe Alexander, who is now part of your Centre for Care, and Phil Kinghorn, who's a health economist at the university, and also Kelly Haywood, who's a co-researcher on the project, someone with lived experience of care. Also, there's a sort of the other part of the project I'm going to share with you is some ongoing work with Janelle Curlin and Meng Yi from Georgia State University in the USA. So I'm kind of combining these two bits of research that sort of started off in slightly different places, but I've managed to connect them together and make sense of what social enterprises are contributing to adult social care. So just, I guess, the starting point, I'm not going to dwell on this because this is kind of what everyone already knows. Social care in England is very much underpinned by a kind of marketised system that's primarily delivered by the private sector. So, around, again, for 80% of care services are delivered by the private for-profit sector. And then there's questions that come out of that have sort of been ongoing for some time around sort of profit, competition, cost, and actually is the kind of dominance of the for-profit sector leading to some of the issues that we have with social care, the social care crisis that we're all very much aware of in terms of increasing demand, quality of care, the staffing crisis. Obviously, COVID and Brexit have enhanced this crisis even further. So, I suppose part of the starting point for me is around that kind of profit motive and social care crisis. Are they connected? And part of this is about demands for reform have come out of the current kind of context. So, does social enterprise potentially offer a solution to the kind of social care crisis? So, social enterprises are basically businesses with a social mission. So the sort of formal definition I've put on there, which was kind of developed a couple of decades ago, but is still quite widely used, is businesses with primarily social objectives whose surpluses are principally reinvested for that purpose in the business or in the community, rather than being driven by the need to maximise profit for shareholders and owners. So yeah, we're talking about an organisation that is there to make a profit. So it's really important to remember that social enterprises should and can make a profit, but actually that profit is then reinvested back into the social mission, back into the community, back into that organisation, back into the staffing. Social enterprises are classed as hybrid organisations. Their hybridity coming from three coexisting institutional logics of the public sector, civil society and business. So basically it's a combination of a commitment to public values, a social ethos and a commercial sort of and financial ethos. And I guess it's just important to note, I guess, that social enterprises are not sort of fixed, you know, they're not a specific organisational form. They don't have to have, you know, an exact mix of these three logics. What you get with social enterprises is a vast array of different types of organisations, almost, I suppose, spanning from those that look more like businesses to those that look more like charities. So they are quite broad. The definition is quite broad. The whole field is quite broad. So what I've been trying to do is make sense of where social enterprises fit, what they look like, how they're defined, particularly within the social care space. So just thinking a bit more about hybridity. I mean, hybridity has been talked about as a combination of, you know, being sort of underpinned by the culture and identity of an organisation, and the hybridity kind of plays out through the culture and identity. And coming from that, social enterprises are sometimes talked about as an organisational form, as a legal form, but actually social enterprises can also be seen as a way of working, so an orientation rather than an organisation. So I'm going to come back to this later on when we start to think about what social enterprises are in the social care sector and what we might learn from them, or how we might use the social enterprise model to think about the social care crisis. So what do we know so far about social enterprises in the social care sector? So in terms of the policy and practice side, social enterprises going back, you know, I suppose a couple of decades now, so the late 2000s, early 2010s, social enterprises received a lot of policy emphasis. They were championed by the UK government, particularly through the then Department of Health. And basically, the Department of Health invested huge amounts of money and effort in setting up new and enhancing existing social enterprises in the health and social care sector. So in the sort of late 2000s, they set up the Social Enterprise Investment Fund, which ended up being £120 million of Department of Health money that went into supporting social enterprises in health and social care. There was a massive emphasis on the public service mutual in health and social care. So sort of spin out. So NHS and local authority staff were encouraged to think about taking their service out of the public sector and into an independent social enterprise. And actually that happened quite widely, more so on the health side, but also on the social care side. So a lot of local authority staff have taken their service out into an independent social enterprise. There was a massive drive for this, as I say, sort of 15 or so years ago now. Why did they do this? I guess the reported benefit, which kind of stemmed from sort of government, particularly, were around the empowerment of staff. So the recognition that particularly when it comes to the sort of spin out social enterprises, that staff were kind of constrained by NHS and local authority bureaucracy, and actually giving them more empowerment, more freedom to innovate, they could lead to more creative health and social care solutions, which also offered more choice and control for people who use services. And at the same time, they could be more commercially sustainable, thinking about the kind of diversity of income sources. So the idea is that social enterprises have multiple income sources. They maybe trade with the public sector, so they maybe have contracts to deliver services, but actually they trade directly with the public. And in social care, you know, it's about working across different funding streams. And ultimately, this was deemed to lead to higher service user satisfaction, more choice and control for people who use services. There was a body of research at the time. Partly I did some work in this space sort of 10 years or so ago, primarily though in the health, what we call the kind of health and well-being area. There's been very little on the social care side. There's some research from the sector itself looking at social enterprises and social care. So organisations like Power to Change and Cooperatives UK have published quite a lot, particularly of reviews, often published by the social enterprises themselves. So in terms of academic research, there's very little. What we do also know is that there's around 5,000 social enterprises delivering social care in England, and that's based on Social Enterprise UK data. But I guess one of the issues here is that defining a social enterprise and defining social care is actually really tricky, and that's one of the things that I've sort of been trying to do, just because of the kind of woolly definition of both, you know, social enterprise and social care in terms of what it does and doesn't include. I'll say more about that in a minute. On the sort of academic research side, in the UK and internationally, what we've seen is that for-profit social care organisations are generally found to deliver lower quality and poorer outcomes than not-for-profit and public providers. So particularly research in the US has shown higher rates of abuse and neglect in for-profit, particularly nursing and residential homes, which has been linked back to a lower investment in staffing. In Scotland and England, sort of inspection data, CQC and equivalent data has been analysed, which again shows that not-for-profit and public providers have better quality ratings than for-profits. So what we do know is that for-profits and public sector organisations are generally deemed to have higher quality and better outcomes than for-profits. But what we don't know is where social enterprises fit within that. So social enterprises are some, you know, in various different categories across the for-profit and not-for-profit. So actually we can't actually say anything from the existing research about what social enterprises can offer and how they compare. So this is one of the gaps I've been trying to fill. So moving on, so as I say, so this is what I'm trying to do. I've been doing my research over the last couple of years. I've basically been exploring the contribution of social enterprise to the adult social care sector. So 3 key questions that I've been answering, which I'm going to share with you today. One is, what is a care social enterprise? Just because there's so little on this topic that actually we don't really know what a care social enterprise looks like, or what I'm terming from here on a care social enterprise. Second is, what are their distinctive qualities? And the third is, how do they compare with other organisational models in social care? So the starting point for the research really in terms of defining social enterprise and social care was, for social enterprise, any organisation that self-defines as a social enterprise, any community interest company, which is the sort of the recognised legal form for a social enterprise, or anything that's on a sort of social enterprise list, like, you know, a local authority list of social enterprises, for example, we included as social enterprises. And in terms of social care, taking a fairly broad definition for the majority of the research on what we mean by social care. So in terms of, you know, social care being support for people to live independently, and we're including within that things like social support. So fairly broad definitions of both. So in the research, we kind of collected a fair bit of data, which I'm currently kind of pulling together into a sort of holistic story of social enterprises. So first of all was a literature review, basically, you know, looking at what evidence exists. And as I sort of briefly showed earlier, there isn't very much. There is a little bit of evidence, quite a lot on social, well, not a lot, but a decent amount on social enterprises in the sort of health and well-being space, but very little specifically in the social care space. So what we did was started with a mapping. So to answer that question of what is a care social enterprise, we identified 3 local authority areas, and within those, sort of searched for as many social enterprises as we could find. So we had a good picture of what they were. And within that, we sort of looked at, turnover, staffing, as much data as we could gather sort of through, website, publicly available sources. So the 3 sites, so the first table on the top shows the 3 sites that we chose. The first was a large city. Over half were day services. There were 62 social enterprises in total. And what we found in that area was that social enterprise wasn't sort of talked about or used differently by the local authority particularly. They weren't sort of separated out from the voluntary and community sector. So social enterprises were part of the broader voluntary community social enterprise sector. In the second site, that was quite different. Sort of post-industrial town where the council itself invested huge amounts into social enterprises, so community interest companies. So they basically said social enterprise is the model we want to use. It wasn't kind of the voluntary sector as a whole, it was social enterprises, particularly in day services, but actually also across the home care sector too. Third site was a rural area. In that site, again, that looked very different. There were a small number of large sort of spin-out social enterprises that sort of emerged 10, 15 years ago. And then this separate, smaller social enterprise sector. So almost in that area, you had these large spin-outs and then these sort of less known social enterprises that tended to be very small, working at a community level. So yeah, very different in different areas. And I think if we'd gone into other areas, we would have found very different models, again, in terms of how social enterprises were being used to address social care, some of the social care challenges. We also did semi-structured interviews with 33 stakeholders at the local level across these 3 sites, but also nationally. The table on the bottom just shows the breakdown. So this covered sort of third sector, local authority, social care stakeholders, some social entrepreneurs, councillors and someone from a union. We then did case studies in 5 social enterprises. And in those, we spoke to what we call in the kind of social enterprise leader, the social entrepreneur, someone in senior management role, and 18 staff. What we didn't do, and this was on purpose, was to not speak to anyone at this point who used the service. The study was very much about understanding the sector, understanding what was going on, understanding what the kind of reported outcomes were, as opposed to actually getting to the point where we were speaking to people who use the service, people in the community and carers. That's very much next on my list of things to do. So yeah, that's the next step. The other bit of work that we've been doing is looking at the CQC data, identifying social enterprises, comparing. So that's trying to answer that question of how do they compare. So looking at the sector itself is one part of it, but actually unless we know how they compare to other organisational models, we kind of can't get that far. So we analysed the CQC data and we combined that with some of the skills for care data. And this is a piece of work that I've been doing with my colleagues at Georgia State University, Janelle and Meng in the USA. I'll say a little bit more about the methods and what we did for that later. Okay, so question 1, my sort of starting point with this project was very much around what is a care social enterprise, and the mapping work that we did really helped us to kind of answer that question. So the mapping basically showed that the sector was very diverse. As you could probably gather from the 3 sites that I presented in the methods, there was a huge amount of diversity. And actually, apart from the huge amount of sort of policy and practice investment going back kind of 10, 15 years, actually, there's not been much policy, much investment in social enterprises since. So what's kind of ended up happening is there's a massive diversity of localized approaches to social enterprises. And there isn't much in terms of national policy and practice leadership. We also found a massive mix of organisational forms. So a community interest company, as I said, is the only sort of recognised model for social enterprises, which was introduced in 2005, I think, by the UK government. And a third of the social enterprises took that organisational model. tended to be the larger ones, but not exclusively. But the larger social enterprises were probably more likely to be a community interest company. Most of the social enterprises we found were smaller and community-based, so very much embedded into a particular community, meeting the needs of that particular community. Covered a range of support service areas, so around half or just over half were what we're calling day services, supporting people in their own homes. Some of them were kind of what we could call traditional day centres, but actually very few were traditional. They were using things like horticulture, cafes, arts, life skills to support people's care needs, particularly on that sort of social and prevention side of care. About 10% are home care and about 9% are residential care, based on the mapping that we did. What we did find is that from the interviews, there were a lot of people talking about the potential for social enterprises in the home care sector. So I guess that's sort of one area that I see as potentially being a kind of a good area of growth. A lot of the social enterprises were quite integrated in their approaches. So they were operating across healthcare, social care, housing, employment. So this kind of came back to trying to define something as a social care, social enterprise, because actually a lot of them were offering social care services alongside a whole host of other types of services, including housing particularly. But a lot of the larger social enterprises were health and social care, as you might imagine. So second question is, what are the distinctive qualities of care social enterprises? So I guess just sort of coming back to the kind of hybridity and the kind of three institutional logics that underpin social enterprises. In terms of, particularly on the sort of civil society, public sector logics, and there were sort of three things that came out as being really important within the social enterprises and sort of part of the narrative that came out of the interviews. So one was that social enterprises are very much underpinned by an ethic of care. So the ethic of care being that actually, the staff actually care, the staff, it's the sort of staff actually caring about the community, caring about the people that they serve, going above and beyond came out really, really strongly. And that was ingrained into the organisational values, the organisational behaviours. And I mean, there's a couple of quotes on there. The first one, it's organisational values and behaviours that make the difference to people being supported. So the ethic of care came through really strongly. And as I say, as something that was quite ingrained within the organisation, that's what people talked about. That was very much connected to staff and user empowerment. In some cases, that was through sort of formal employee ownership models where staff have staff have actually control of the organisation. They take small amounts of profit from it, although in social care there's very little profit in a lot of these spaces, so it wasn't necessarily profit driven as such, but it was more about the sort of formal side, but also the more informal, where, I mean, again, the second quote, the managers talk to everyone as an equal, including all of the clients, no matter what their disabilities are. So there's that sort of flat management structure in social enterprises, and the notion of kind of equality and empowerment of both staff and of users. The third was around community capacity building. So social enterprises tended to be quite embedded in the community that they supported and had a really good knowledge, really good understanding of that particular community. And again, the quote here, which actually came from a commissioner, said they know the community really well. That's not traditionally been a strength of the public sector. So actually recognition even within the local authorities that actually the social enterprises are really key to actually accessing people and understanding the communities that people live in. Then on the kind of, I suppose, the commercial side, that question of what happens to profit. So the social enterprises, as I say, are set up to make a profit, but what they do with their profit is what is clearly important here. And a lot of the social enterprises invested profits in staff training, bonuses, but as I say, tended to be very, very small. But the training was particularly important. Something that a lot of the social enterprises tended to do was support staff and fund staff to develop new services and ideas. So staff could apply to a fund, and they maybe want a piece of equipment. They wanted to set up a new trial for a new service. They wanted to set something up in the community. They wanted to work with a particular group of their users, and the social enterprises tended to support that. The other thing they invested profits in was running things like user-led disability awareness events in schools. And again, the quote on there just shows, they funded activities, things like sports, discos, community discos were really popular, and they're things that aren't covered through mainstream social services. And they often operate in the gaps where the public service can't deliver or won't deliver. So in all, there was a kind of argument that social enterprises had the potential anyway to build social care capacity, to improve quality, and to bring sort of diversity to the social care sector. On I suppose the flip side of that, there were a load of challenges, as you might imagine, some of which were unique to social enterprises, some more broadly in terms of working in the social care space. One is around, social care is competitive, it's challenging. The private sector are often found to undercut social enterprises. Had a lot of conversations with people since about, are social enterprises more expensive? And in some cases, yes, they are a bit more expensive than some of the for-profits. Not always, but actually, if you look at the social value that they create, so if you take that into account, suddenly they are not more expensive. But again, that kind of comes into how the kind of commissioning cycle, how they're commissioned. Second is a lack of understanding of social enterprises by commissioners, by funders, by the public. And social enterprises, some understand them very well. There's some councils that are investing quite heavily in social enterprises and get them. Others, you say social enterprise and they don't understand what you mean in terms of, you say, oh, you mean, so you say social enterprises, and someone would say, you mean a charity, or, oh, that's an organisation that makes a profit. So it's that kind of middle ground that people often didn't understand, which then kind of translated into not accessing funding. The dual social and financial mission kind of caused problems in some cases, and trying to deliver both is really challenging for organisations. And they found there's a lot of reliance on staff gifting time, for example, staff working weekends, working evenings, not because they're necessarily asked to, it's because they want to. And that comes back to this ethic of care, but actually is this ethic of care creating kind of burnout for staff? So it's kind of a bit of a vicious cycle in a way. Issues around growth, most of these are quite small, but is it their small size that makes them good? If they grow too big, they wouldn't be as good. The thing that is special might be lost. So, is there an opportunity to scale out or scale up social enterprises without actually growing them as organisations and taking them out of that kind of personalised and community-based space that they operate in? Some of them had limited business expertise. Some, particularly the spin-outs, were set up by clinicians, set up by people working in local authorities that have never run a business before. They're often set up as well by people who've had bad experiences of care, people who've used care services or were an unpaid carer. And they basically just knew they could set up a better service, but actually they didn't understand, or they hadn't got the experience on the business side. And the last one was around the lack of evidence, which I've kind of found through this study, particularly on those kind of social and preventative benefits of services. So there's not a huge amount of evidence about social enterprises, which kind of feeds back into that lack of understanding. So the third question, how do social enterprises compare with other organisational models in social care? So everything so far has been very much about what social enterprise is doing, but that kind of question of how do they compare, I think, is really important. So what we did here was took a subsample of care social enterprises, partly because we needed to be able to identify them clearly and connect them to sort of a data source. So we identified community interest companies that were delivering residential and home care, in the CQC data, and then connected that to some skills for care data. So just to explain what we did first of all, so we took the CQC data and identified, I'll say as many as we could of the community interest companies in the data. We hope we've got them all, but yeah, we could have missed a few. We've got as many as we can, I'll certainly say that. Covered a 3-year span of CQC evaluations from 2019 to 2021. And what we did was took the 5 CQC domains and the overall score, and then compared the different organisational models across those domains. So the table at the bottom kind of shows the breakdown of what we included in the analysis. So as you can probably imagine, the not-for-profits, there were more not-for-profits than any other. So you had the providers and then the locations. So the providers being obviously the provider, but actually the locations is the service, if you take it down to the kind of service level. So obviously there's more services than providers. So highest number of for-profit organisations, not-for-profit organisations, so 2,028 not-for-profits, 398 government run services. We identified 82 community interest company social enterprises, and there's an additional category in CQC data. Anyone who knows CQC data quite well, we've got the individual sort of partnership. So basically, rather than an organisation registering, it was registered in the names of an individual. So, Mr. and Mrs. Smith registered their social care company as opposed to, an organisational name. And there were 833 of those, and we're assuming those were small individual partnership type arrangements, often in the sort of residential care space. And then we also combined that with some skills for care data. Skills for care data covered about 50% of our overall sample. And in that, we've particularly so far just focused on staffing and turnover. So we've looked at, that's helped us understand staffing level across the different organisational models, and also staff turnover across the different organisational models. So what did we find? So CQC, the CQC data basically showed that the community interest companies performed the best of all of the different models, all of the different groups. So they performed best overall. So the line at the bottom shows the overall CQC scores, and the CICs came out top, with not-for-profit and government combined second. The CICs also came out top on the rating, the safe, the caring and the well-led ratings. They performed slightly less well on effective and responsive. We don't know why. We need to look into this a bit more. But what basically happened was that the community interest companies, not-for-profits and government all were, across all of the domains, the best, as you might expect, certainly for the not-for-profits and government. The for-profits and the individuals performed a lot worse. There's a kind of black line down the middle just to show there was a massive divide, in that they were clustered very much into the kind of these two groups. We were actually quite surprised to see these individual and partnership organisations performing so poorly, notoriously across all of the different domains. Some areas they were the same, where there's a kind of equal sign, that means they perform pretty much the same, but generally they were kind of worse. So actually this is a really positive picture for social enterprises. They're basically performing the best if you actually compare them. Just looking at the skills for care data, this was quite useful in helping us understand the size and their staffing and turnover. So as we expected, these individual partnership organisations were the smallest, with a median of 20 staff. The CIC, social enterprises, were second, but same as the not-for-profits. For-profits slightly bigger, and the government were the largest. In terms of staffing level and turnover, the staffing level was kind of as we expected. So, number of staff per per user basically, and the individual and the for-profits had the lowest staffing levels. And again, there's that huge gap to the community interest companies, the not-for-profits and the government, which had much higher levels of staffing. What did surprise us though was turnover. So the for-profits were the worst, but then the community interest companies, social enterprises and not-for-profit organisations were second after that. As might be expected, kind of government social care services were at the top end of it, but actually the individual organisations were at the higher end. So kind of tells quite an interesting story. The CICs basically, in terms of staff turnover, don't do so well. So they don't retain, not-for-profits and CICs don't retain their staff as well as these individual. So just, I guess, thinking through some of the implications of this, we've been sort of trying to figure out this data. I mean, this is, I will say, this is very much a work in progress. We're going to be doing some more with the skills for care data, particularly. But just thinking through some of the implications, and I guess the remainder of my presentation really is very much throwing a load of questions out there, which actually some people might be able to help me answer, or it's certainly on my agenda for future research. So community interest companies versus for-profits. So we basically found that community interest companies have a higher probability of better outcomes than for-profits, which could be explained by lower staff coverage and higher staff turnover, because the for-profits performed worse on both of those. So that's one possible explanation. What we can also say is that the profit orientation in community interest companies doesn't necessarily interfere with social outcomes, but it's about what happens with the profit. So profit itself isn't necessarily a problem if you're comparing for-profits and community interest companies that both make a profit, but actually the community interest companies are reinvesting their profits. So is it that bit that makes the difference? Also, the CICs can be set up under two different sort of legal forms. One being a community limited by guarantee, which is more for-profit, more not-for-profit, sorry, or a community limited, a company limited by shares, which has more capacity to distribute profits. So one of the things we're going to do next is have a look at the breakdown of the CICs, just to see if whether being a company limited by guarantee or shares actually makes any difference. So that's sort of on the agenda of things to do. Next is how do community interest companies compare to the individual organisations? So they have a higher probability of better outcomes than social care entities run by these individual and partnerships. This was quite unexpected, as I said, because I mean, I was involved with Catherine Needham and colleagues on some research around micro enterprises in the care sector. And generally what we found from that, and what the evidence has suggested elsewhere, is that smaller is better when it comes to social care. They're more personalised, more flexible, and more valued outcomes. So if these small individual and partnership organisations are performing the worst, why is that? So it might be because of their low staffing level. That's one possible explanation. Or actually, maybe they're less professionalised, less regulated, have fewer staff. They don't have whole departments set up to, support CQC inspections, for example. They're not geared up for this. So actually, they may be delivering good outcomes, but we just can't see that through the way we measure social care at the moment. So if they delivered better, so maybe they would deliver better outcomes if we used other measurement processes. For example, they perform really well on staff turnover, so they're retaining their staff. Therefore, they must be doing something. Okay, so is it the sort of CQC and the measurement that is a problem here? Comparing CICs to government, they have a higher probability of higher quality on all but two ratings. So the effective and responsive were where the government organisations were performing better. They are bigger, but they generally perform better on staff levels and turnover. So potentially that's one explanation that can sort of explain why they're performing better on sort of CQC. They're also potentially set up better for CQC. I had a conversation with someone who said, they're often told in advance when the inspection will be, whereas for-profits might not be. Don't know how true that is. It's just something that I've heard. There is a question here around the implications for these spin-out social care organisations, the ones that change from government to CIC status. And that's a piece of work that I'm going to carry on doing, comparing the spin-outs to the non-spin-out social enterprises. And there have been some concerns that the quality of social care would decline when government-run organisations transition into social enterprises, and there's kind of a question here that's very much unfounded, that actually potentially they are better, which kind of comes back to the reason for the massive investment in policy going back 15 years or so. CICs also have a high probability of better outcomes than the not-for-profits, again with the exception of just two domains. It's not related to staffing, as they have similar staffing and turnover levels, so there's no differences there from what we've seen. So the question is, do reinvested profit and access to investors that CICs have support social care quality better than traditional kind of non-profit donative income? So that's a question we can look into. And why do CICs have poorer outcomes than not-for-profits on those two effective and responsive domains? So that's, again, something we need to look into a little bit more. But I suppose what we've basically found is there's not a huge amount of difference between CICs and not-for-profits. And actually CICs are performing slightly better. Okay, so what is, okay, I'll pull all this data, what's it telling us, and where am I going to go next? So overall, the picture of social enterprises in the social care sector is, I would say, a positive one. And this sort of profit bad, not-for-profit good assumption that underpins social care is really not straightforward at all. And social enterprises offer a really good example of where boundaries of profit, not-for-profit are blurred. Social enterprises demonstrate strong leadership, an ethic of care that's really evident within the organisations and potentially translates into the outcomes they're reported to deliver, and they do perform better on quality measures. And I will stress that obviously our analysis was at a specific point in time, and I think what we need to do moving forward is to replicate the CQC analysis just to make sure it holds true. Final thing, I guess, is just questions I'm left pondering. I've already thrown loads of questions out, I think. And actually this project's almost created more questions than answered them. So I guess the big questions that I'm sort of thinking through at the moment, first one, is it the social enterprise model that leads to higher quality and a strong care ethic? It's that, is it the social enterprise model that makes a difference? Or actually, is it more coming back to the kind of hybridity and way of working? So is it an orientation rather than an organisation? So that kind of goes into the question of, can these qualities be sort of replicated in any for-profit or not-for-profit or any type of organisation? So this ethic of care that we found so strongly in social enterprises, actually, is that what we need to replicate? And does the fact that it's a social enterprise make any difference at all? I mean, the private sector isn't necessarily all bad. It tends to be seen as bad, or less good, shall we say. And actually, there's some really good examples of for-profits reinvesting their profit and delivering really responsive, innovative and quality care. So that there's kind of some assumptions that we need to unpack a bit. The issue around size is a really interesting one. Going back to the is smaller better in social care. The fact that evidence previously suggests that small is better, but the CQC analysis disputes this. But then the qualitative evidence suggests that the smaller social enterprises are more personalised, more flexible. So there's definitely something around size going on here. And then there's that just the general question: is profit a good thing in social care? And it's about what happens to those profits. So basically, I would say more research is needed. I'm very conscious of this. There's a whole load of questions that I am keen to answer, and I'll see if anyone has any questions or thoughts on any of those. So I will stop there.